Mike, welcome.
Hey, great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
So, look, I have to be honest. I don't know if your family would share the sentiment, obviously, but it feels wrong to call you Mike Costello in these parts, I have to say. And then I did do
the Costello, yeah.
I did a quick look, and I saw both parents from Galway. So I suspect your father, Peter, he came from Spiddal as a Costello, did he?
He did, yeah. Yeah, I've just been back there actually a couple of weeks ago to see both sides of the family. Dad was from Spiddal and Mum from Loughrea, so I still go back at least once a year to see, unfortunately, what's left of those families now. Mum and Dad are gone, and brothers and sisters are dwindling, but I still go back to see the cousins and the family that's there, and yeah, it's still a huge part of my life, obviously.
Both from Galway. They had to go to London to meet each other, though.
Yes. In fact, they met in Birmingham and then later on in London and then got married in the mid-50s. So we're here for the best part of 60 years, each of them, yeah, and never lost a semblance of their accent. Everybody, pals and my partner, Christine, could never understand how they were here for so long and yet never lost just even a tiny semblance of the accent.
And how do they feel about their beautiful boy Mike talking like a good old-fashioned London lad?
I mean, that's something they didn't have any control of. With me going to school with a load of Cockney pals in South London from the age of 5 or 6, then they didn't have a lot of control over that, I'm afraid. But it is incredible, given where we lived and for how long they were here. And I guess it was because for a long time, there was such a huge Irish diaspora in South London, but also in big chunks of North London as well. So, it's not surprised that they held on to that accent for so long, given that they were around their own kind of people for so long before, as I say, that kind of diaspora over here started to quite literally die away.
So when, Jack Charlton and Ireland are doing rather well in the football, is this a Republic of Ireland household? Are you supporting Ireland at the time, or are you gazing up at Lineker and the lads and they're your team?
This is something I'll use a kind of an anecdote here to describe how I've always felt about this. I was covering, luckily enough, one of Britain's greatest athletes, 400 metres Olympic and world champion Christine Ohurugu. And there was a debate and a controversy during her career once about how much she actually cared about the British vest, and she'd mentioned her Nigerian roots. And she said that because she was getting a lot of stick in the British media relating to 3 missed tests that resulted in a ban for her, she said that she might one day go and compete for Nigeria. It was one of these throwaway lines that you see and hear at news conferences when athletes are getting a bit piqued by what the media are saying. And she said that she would be just as proud to run for Nigeria as she was running for Britain. And that's how I've always felt about competing for Ireland. I mean, I have good friends. I boxed as a kid from the age of just after 10, nearly 11, through till I was 21. And 2 very good friends of mine from the same kind of background, born and raised in South London, but with Irish parents, boxed for the Republic of Ireland. And that, if that opportunity had come to me, I'd have had no hesitation in taking up the invitation. But at the same time, I would have been very proud to wear the 3 Lions of England on my vest as well. So it's very much each of one. It wouldn't have had a great effect on my career over here at that time. But for at the same time, I gladly would have represented Ireland just as proudly as wearing that English vest.
I in some respects, that's the more natural, appropriate response than picking one or the other. Makes perfect sense. Sorry, we are going to talk about Arlington, by the way, but just when did your parents pass, Mike?
My dad passed in 2009, actually in Ireland. He was away on holiday there at the time, and we have this kind of maybe overly romantic feeling that he went back home to die. And Mum died actually of COVID soon after the outbreak here in 2020. She was afflicted in March of 2020 and then passed away in May of 2020.
Oh,
so it's been 4 years since either Mum or Dad has been here. But as I say, I tried to I say try. It's not an effort at all to keep up the links with Ireland, and going back to Galway is something I look forward to every year. Where they are from, Dad in Spiddle and Mum in a village just 3 miles from Loughrea called Kilcreast. It's so remote in both of those places. In many senses, it's like going back in time, and yet to get from one to the other, I have to go through this, the vibrant, busy, bustling city of Galway. So I see the best of both worlds, and I realise all that's going on in Ireland with the conflict over immigration and that kind of thing, and I hear it when I go there. And it's interesting that watching the American election just recently, we've had our election over here in the UK, and the same issues are coming up time and time again, it seems, wherever you travel to.
One of the lines I saw you say about your dad was he was so proud of our family, and I remember thinking, I'll get our name into the BBC archives, Dad. I'll get it there for you. So I guess he would have missed 2012, which I know you've said is a regret of yours, but he would have nonetheless seen you do great things in your career. Gosh, I mean, both your parents must have got a real kick out of, well, look at us trying to come over here in the late 50s, 60s from like west of Ireland, and there's our son on the bloody BBC of all things holding court. I mean, that must have kind of tickled them late at night when they're having a coffee.
Yeah, why couldn't he crack it on RTE? Yeah. Yeah. No, they were very proud, and it wasn't as if they were upfront about that like a lot of Irish parents, but it's one I heard from aunts and uncles and from friends what Mum and Dad had been saying about it, how proud they were, and Mum would sit in the kitchen listening to the radio. I mean, she was a big fan of Radio 2 over here, and every now and again they would play a piece of commentary or a report of mine, and it would come on by surprise when she wasn't expecting it, and then she'd pick up the phone and say, I've just heard you on the radio, and then she'd say, like, where are you, what have you been doing, and then get me to fill her in detail as to what I've been up to. Mum wasn't really across sport anything like the way that Dad was, but both of them, they were very proud of what I did.
You're I mean, again, we're not turning this into a career interview, but was kind of struck. So you kind of went into the Beeb as a teenager, and you bide your time a little bit working in the accounts department and doing that kind of stuff, and late 80s, bit of cricket into 90s athletics and the Barcelona games. Everyone needs a break in life. You got the 21st century for you is kind of kick-started because John Rawling loses his voice at the Commonwealth Games in 2002. Tell us about that. That was kind of an amazing few days.
Yeah, that was. And by then, I'd kind of given up on boxing in terms of, in any way carving out the career as a commentator. I was working at ringside for the BBC World Service and occasionally for BBC 5 Live as the ringside reporter, not doing commentary. So I started out in athletics, not just because that was a sport that was there and was free in terms of anybody chasing it at the BBC World Service in the mid-1990s, but I'd grown up with a great love of athletics, and I've always said that there are many, many parallels between athletics and boxing in the simplest case that they're very individual sports, and the mind is so important as well as the body in terms of the outcome of performance. But that time at the Commonwealth Games in Manchester in 2002 is something I explain and use almost as a guide to young commentators who ask me how to break through and what avenues to pursue. And I say, you are going to have to wait for your break. I mean, I was 42 by the time that came around. Now, I was having a great time, but there was still something inside me. There was an itch. There was something telling me that I could do more than I was doing at that time. I was making documentaries. I was working on sports desks. I was producing all sorts of programs. So like anybody watching this who's worked in sports broadcasting, I was doing just about every job there was to do and having great fun. I've been traveling the world because I worked for the BBC World Service, and for a long while worked on a documentary strand. Then I was traveling. In the end, I traveled to more than 60 countries for the BBC. So it wasn't as if I wasn't having a great time, but as I say, I was still waiting for this chance to really really prove myself in one of my two sports. And I'd pretty much given up on boxing because over here in the UK, there were pretty much two opportunities to commentate on boxing. One of them was on Sky Sports, which at the time was being done by Ian Darp, another of my predecessors on BBC Radio. And at the time, then it was being done on radio by John Rawling. And so that was why I'd veered towards athletics, because there was an opportunity for me to commentate. And so by the time 2002 came around, I was kind of on the radar for the BBC's domestic radio service, 5 Live at the time. But I was only ever filling in for John Rawling when he would be doing maybe a big fight that coincided with a big athletics meeting. So they knew pretty much what I could do. And on this particular night, it was the Monday night of the athletics competition. So 3 or 4 nights into the competition at the Commonwealth Games in Manchester. And the previous night, Paula Radcliffe had won the 5,000 metres, and John had really gone for that over the course of the 12 and a half laps. It had been really raucous because it was a home gold medal. And John's voice had really suffered as a result of that. When he came on air at about 5:30 on the Monday afternoon, he was doing a very quick preview into a sports desk at 5:30 and couldn't even get through 30 seconds worth. And so the producer at the time, a guy called Matthew Allen, who's been a great help to my career, came running up 2 rows behind, ashen-faced, and said to me, Mike, what are you doing tonight? What are your commitments for the BBC World Service? And I said, well, I've got half a dozen news bulletin inserts, but nothing in terms of live commentary. And so he said, look, we can cover those, but can you come down here and do the commentary for the evening? And this was the competition was starting at 6 o'clock. So I had basically 20 minutes to get my head around this. But when I go back to what I said as a guide to young commentators, I had done quite a lot of homework, not necessarily about the English and the Welsh and the Scottish athletes, but about the races in general that were coming up that evening. So I've done a decent pocket of homework that at least got me in that kind of groove, so that when I went on air at 6 o'clock, it wasn't as if I was looking down at start lists that were full of a list of strangers that I hadn't studied up on. So the point I say, and the lesson I say for youngsters, is that I was ready. When the break came, I was there, prepared and ready. Now, I'd done that, what I did that night in terms of the homework, the prep, I'd done that 100 times and got nothing for it. Yeah. But when I needed it, when the time came, when the break came, I was ready. And the first night went well. John's voice didn't return, so I did the last 3 nights of the Commonwealth Games, the Monday, Tuesday and Wednesday, and everybody there loved what I did. And that was a huge turning point for me, because later on then, just 3 years later, when John was headhunted by ITV over here, ITV were getting back into boxing in a big way. He was headhunted, and then I was given the job as correspondent, both in boxing and in track and field athletics for 5 Live. So it was a long road, but I was having a good time on the way there. And then finally, when I got to establish myself in the position as a correspondent, then that's when my career really flourished, and did so for the last 15 years or so.
An overnight success after 30 years, I guess, is the lesson there. By the way, just a technical question for me. I thought this was kind of fascinating. I read an interview you did about the games in 2012, and you decided, listen, this is a big deal, and this, we mentioned your dad and the archives. This is going to be one of those commentaries across the 2012 Olympics, which will be played back in some shape or form for years to come. And you went to see a voice coach who works in dramatics, and I thought it just, we don't give too much thought, I suppose, to the technical aspects of what you do. And you said she played back some athletics and boxing commentaries that I'd done, and on some of the boxing ones, I was screeching. She could not work out why. And then she started saying, well, where do you sit and what's around you? What's your vista? And she comes to the conclusion that in boxing, you're generally sitting ringside and looking up ever so slightly at the action, whereas in athletics, you're obviously in a stand looking down. And so she concluded that you were stretching the muscles in your neck, and that was therefore affecting your vocal cords and the quality of the sound coming out. And so you make some adjustments. I mean, that kind of stuff most people are not thinking about.
Yeah, and to some it might sound poncy that you go into that kind of detail just to do your job, but that was what I wanted to do. Luckily, there were people around because often in this game, people will hear broadcasters, producers or editors will hear broadcasters making mistakes, and they're too sheepish to say anything about it. But luckily, I had two people who picked up on this, and this was 2011. So just a year before the Olympics, and I was already thinking, as you can gather from what I was saying about my dad and getting the name into the BBC's archives. I was already thinking then how important the Olympics was going to be. So here, a year out, I decided that I was going to do something about it, and went to see this drama teacher who was now working for a body that was called the College of Journalism at BBC, which was pretty much an in-house college, an in-house university within the BBC. It was a brilliant initiative. And so I went to see Elspeth, this drama teacher, and she told me and gave me these hints. And the next big event I went to was a huge world title fight, heavyweight world title fight in Hamburg between Vladimir Klitschko and David Haye. And it was then, even on an occasion as big as that, I said, look, if I'm not going to try these new methods now, then I'm never going to get used to it. I'm going to slip back into the bad habits the whole time. So for this fight in Hamburg in the middle of 2011, I tried these kind of new techniques and about, kind of being careful about stretching the neck, but also about the ability to pause, because the reason you screech is that you've said too many words in a single sentence. And she said to me, look, if you pause for half a second, when you're on air, that might feel like a serious length of time to you, but actually to the listener, it will just flick by. So you have got half a second to pause, take the quickest of breaths, carry on again. And instead of going to the end, if there's 50 words in that sentence, break it up 25 and 25. If you go to 50, by the time you get to 50, you will be squealing. So just have that in mind. And the first time I used that kind of new technique was in this huge fight, and that went well, and so that gave me the confidence to carry on like that. And then by the time I got to 2012, we're still very much aware of this in my mind. But when there were huge races, for example, on Super Saturday, I was able to break up the sentences into phrases, rather than go for the whole sentence at a time. Now, I'm not saying with the crowd and the noise at the decibel level it was at 2012 that I never slipped into that, but I was always very much aware of that during the whole games.
One last one. So you made the switch to go to DAZN in 2021. So that switch from radio to TV, we were just talking about it before you jumped on the call, that obviously boxing commentary, you're pretty much talking for the 3 minutes. The pundit gets his or her opportunity between rounds, whereas TV, it's a bit more of a dance with your partners. Are you enjoying the TV aspect?
Yeah, and it could hardly be more different, and that's the reason I've been enjoying it so much. I've just signed on for another year with Matchroom and DAZN. My contract is actually with Matchroom, and all of the shows are on DAZN. But if you take my other sport, for example, track and field athletics, if I'd moved across to television in that sport, then it wouldn't have been nearly as different. And I always say, if you take my commentary in the Olympics of a men's, women's 100 meters final, and then just play that alongside, for example, the RTE television version of the 100 meters final, that same 100 meters final, you wouldn't actually notice much difference because it's so high paced. And the key is to identify who's where. And even in the longer distance races, the commentary wouldn't be that different, because the key element of athletics commentary, before you even talk about flair or flannel or flower, any adding of any personality of the commentator, the key is ID. You've got to identify who's in front, who's fallen, who's behind, or whatever. Whereas in boxing, ID is not an issue. So everybody knows who is who up there in the ring, and therefore it's a very different kind of commentary. It's been a great challenge, and there was a period of 4 or 5 years where I was being offered gigs as one-offs here and there, and was never allowed to do them by the BBC, quite rightly so. And so when the opportunity came to do TV full time and have a sustained go at it, then it was something that I couldn't resist. It came at a very good time in my career when there were uncertainties around because of COVID, but of other issues, financial, budgetary issues at the BBC. So it came at a good time, and it's been every bit the challenge that I thought it would be, but absolutely fascinating, and I've loved it so far.
Great. Let's move on to Friday night then.
So, which part of Friday night?
This will be available on all Netflix plans. So this is going to have a gargantuan audience right around the world. Taylor Serrano is expected to get underway around 3 a.m. Irish time. We will have 10 2-minute rounds. And then Paul v. Tyson, 4 a.m., 8 2-minute rounds. And so this evening we'll have open workouts, 11:30 Irish time. Wednesday, the pre-fight press conferences, midnight Irish time on Netflix, streaming live. And then Thursday, the weigh-ins, again, right across social channels. So it's going to be a very visible fight, and there is no pay-per-view aspect to it. We might start with Taylor Serrano, I think. So their fight is now 2.5 years ago, all of a sudden. Split decision win for Taylor in 2022 at Madison Square Garden. Were you there, Mike? Were you watching from afar?
No, I was watching that one from afar, but it's you would probably agree it's one of the best fights I've ever seen, and there's no need to attach the label women's fight to that. It's genuinely one of the best fights I've ever seen, and you know, what a place for it to happen.
What made it so good?
It was the competitiveness, and for me, the key criterion for a great fight is one that sways one way, then the other, and back again more than once, more than twice, more than 3 times during the course of a fight. And there were a number of occasions on that night when you felt that Serrano was going to win. Likewise, a number of occasions when you felt that Katie Taylor was going to win. And that's why it was so special. And if you look at the way they went at each other in that final round, all the way through to the final bell, and you got the impression that if that had been over 20 rounds, they would have done exactly the same. And there was something in there about the need to win, the need for Serrano to beat Taylor, the need for Taylor to beat Serrano in terms of their reputation, and almost bolstering all that they'd done in the sport before. It seemed that each of them felt that a win on that night would elevate them even higher.
How clear-cut a winner was Taylor? Split decision.
Yeah, I got to say, I wouldn't have argued had Serrano been given the nod. I thought it was a very, very close fight. At the end of it, I did have Taylor winning 6-4, but I wouldn't have argued if it had gone the other way. And I get the sense that we might see something similar on Friday night. I know they've moved on in different ways, and it's 2.5 years on, but I just get the impression that sometimes if you look at the great rivalries in boxing down the years, it's the kind of fight that, to me, is going to draw the best from each of them. Although, having said that, I do look back at the great rematches which became trilogies. If you look at Ali against Frazier in the 1970s, Antonio Barrera against Eric Morales, Mickey Ward and Arturo Gatti, the second fights in those series were not nearly as entertaining as the first. And it's almost, I've spoken with Powers about this, who've boxed and won world titles, and it's almost as if they say to each other, we're not going to go through that again. So although I say that they are so closely, evenly matched, I can't really see anything but a very, very competitive fight. I don't know that it will be quite as exciting as it was first time around.
I think Taylor's camp might be okay with that, you know. Whatever about Taylor herself. Like, I watched it back again last night. I had forgotten just the brutality of the 5th round in particular, where in 2 minutes, Serrano throws just over 100 punches and lands 44 of them in 2 minutes. Now, Taylor lands 14 to Serrano's 44. Like, she just has the head beaten off her. There's no two ways about it. She's barely able to digest what's been said to her in the corner afterwards. And if you press pause at that point and ask the viewer what's happening, everybody says the same thing. It was borderline miraculous.
And what was miraculous, not just about the comeback, but in that fifth round, and this is a fight I've watched over and over again, and I think this says pretty much everything in one punch about Katie Taylor, who she is, what she is, and why she is so revered, and why she's being so successful. To use your phrase, she had the head beaten off her for most of the 2 minutes. Have a look at the end. As the bell sounds, she throws a big right hand right at the end of maybe the worst round of her entire career, amateur and pro. She throws a big right hand as if to say, I'm still here. And sure, the sixth round didn't go her way either, but she did gradually work her way back into the fight. And it's just that I love stuff like that. Just that cameo at the end of the fifth round. Go back and watch it. She throws a big right hand. It's the last punch of the round. And it's as if to say, you thought I was gone. You all thought I was gone. Here I am. I'm still here. Just a fascinating part of a great, great fight.
What's your sense of that? Like, I think genetically some people can take a punch and others can't. Like, there is an aspect there, but it's hard not to think that that's majority just personality, character.
It is, and years in terms of the background of training as well. And those, who might have concerns about Katie Taylor, about now being 38, it's nights like that, and it's the ability to take punches like that generate that kind of concern. How much longer can she go on? You go all the way back to 2001, to that first official amateur fight, but there'd been loads of sparring before then. And I remember doing kind of a detailed study on her amateur career, and because she got so far in most of the tournaments, there's a healthy amount to watch on YouTube, and you sometimes forget, because these fights were, and I'm going to put in inverted commas, only 4 2-minute rounds. You tend to think that it's a bit of a flash in the pan, and that there'll be no long-term effect. But she fought at a very high level, and what cannot be underestimated is that boxing 4 and 5 times in 10 days at the Europeans and the World Championships, and twice at the Olympic Games, making weight each time is very, very innovating on the body. And she was doing that for a long, long time before even turning professional. So, the wear and tear is eventually going to take effect. Yeah. But if you have that view, then you watch the way that she responded on that night at Madison Square Garden, and you'd almost say that she's some kind of anomaly that is managing to fend off the ravages of time and keep on producing what she needs on the night, if not her best, and certainly enough to go on and win, albeit it wasn't enough first time round against Chantel Cameron, but still another incredible night. And look, I'm going on a bit here, but if you look at the night against Serrano, the 2 nights in Dublin against Chantel Cameron, and I was lucky enough to be there for the zone on those nights, and you could never convince me that there were only 9,500, 10,000, whatever the arena there in Dublin holds. You could never convince me that was the number of people in there, because it sounded like 3 and 4 times that number. And the point I'm getting to make here is that we are, as she said, I heard an interview she did with Steve Bunce on the BBC this week. She said, look, I realise I'm in the latter part of my career. We all know that, but it's now I'm starting to think about those nights against Serrano, against Cameron, and there've been others. Just how much she has given to this game, and what a massive void she is going to leave when she finally walks away from the sport. Because at the moment, the great surge that there was behind women's boxing around COVID and the pandemic, when it was financially prudent for the promoters to put women on, because to use the word of Ellie Scottney, our super bantamweight world champion over here in the UK, she said women at that stage came cheap, and so that's why there was a great boost to women's boxing during COVID. But if you look at a lot of the big names in women's boxing right now, they're boxing only once a year. Savannah Marshall, Clarissa Shields have drifted over into MMA. So we're really starting to get a very, very clear idea of how important Katie Taylor is to women's boxing, but to boxing generally.
Interesting. I hadn't realised that. I heard that same interview, listened to it this morning with Steve Bunce. I mean, she also, not in an overly chippy way, but, Steve was asking her, how are you still doing it? What do you do? Still in the gym and you're 38. And she said, yeah, no, I love it. And I'm just glad I don't listen to all those people who said I should have retired. So it was that little kind of put down to everybody who's kind of saying, Katie, when's enough?
And it's that kind of attitude that's got her where she is.
Yeah. The thing, or one of the question marks going into the fight 2.5 years ago was, could Serrano, who is a 7-weight world champion, could she pack a punch at 135 pounds? Now, she really could. She hurt Taylor. There's no two ways about it. Her power translated. This fight on Friday is up to 138 pounds. That, I presume, if her power translated at 135, it'll be just fine at 138. She'll still be able to hurt Taylor.
I don't know, because, again, we can dismiss 3 pounds as being only 3 pounds, but, they're in the lower weight divisions. That's the difference between weight divisions. And so I happen to think that this does give Katie Taylor an advantage, and not just because of the rise in weight. If it had been first time around, then maybe not so, but she's been through 2 fights against a very, very strong Chantel Cameron. And I think that this actually might be a significant factor,
right,
when we get to Friday night. But look, I realise how close it was at lightweight back at Madison Square Garden in April of 2022. But I just think with Katie Taylor having had now this extra experience at super lightweight, and okay, this is just underneath super lightweight, but by the time they get to the ring, I think the advantage that Taylor has might be significant. And if you look back at the career of Serrano, and look again, she upended these kind of thoughts and predictions in that first fight, but she's had only one world title fight at super lightweight. So it's not a division that she's absolutely used to. And that fight at super lightweight, just to move off at a slight tangent,
yeah,
because it's a case of me and I think many others are still coming to understand women's boxing and the ability to dance around the weights and what sort of difference that will make, which does feed into Friday night. Because when Serrano won a world title at super lightweight, 4 months later, just 4 months later, she won a world title at super flyweight, which is just staggering. It's 25 pounds. It's getting on for 2 stone in our money. And I know Manny Pacquiao and others have danced through the weights, but not to that degree in 4 months. And so, the way women make weight, and look, I know in many ways it's obvious, but I think we are all still learning about the ability of women to move up and down. And I think as the standard gets better over the years, I think the ability to do that will be greatly reduced. But I do think naturally that there will be an advantage for Katie Taylor on Friday night.
Okay, interesting. You mentioned you're at the 2 Chantel Cameron fights last year. Obviously, one of those was a defeat for Taylor in May. You've seen her up close and personal for a long time now. Mike, to what extent is she physically diminished over the last 2.5 years, if at all?
If you look at the second fight against Chantel Cameron, then, she produced one of the best performances of her career when she needed it. And so that performance would suggest that there hasn't been any tailing off of her ability in terms of the speed, the accuracy, the ability to read her opponent, and the ability to take a punch. So it's hard to decipher exactly where she is in terms of if there is any degrading of that ability. But one point I would make is that this is the longest gap she's had between fights in her professional career, I'd assume in her amateur career as well. And so you could look at that 2 ways. At the age of 38, does that leave her fresh? Or at the age of 38, does that mean that she really could have done with a fight in between, as Serrano has had on the night that this fight should have taken place? Serrano did actually box, albeit it was only a couple of rounds. She had to go through all the weight-making process, the press conference, etc. So she has had at least that one outing. So does that long gap that Taylor's had work in her favor, or does it work against her? I think that's, for me, is one of the really interesting elements about Friday.
Okay. Gun to your head, what would you say?
I think Taylor wins. I think she wins again. I think it's going to be close again. I'm not sure it will be as exciting as the first fight for the reasons I explained earlier, but I think Katie wins again.
That will be 3 a.m. At 4 a.m., Mike Tyson and Jake Paul get it on.
I'll be asleep by then.
Really? This this is
I'm
not
really
tickling your...
interested in. You know, I've been reading some very respected columnists this week saying it's a disgrace, but I will be watching. I don't know. I just don't get this. I don't get this. And I'm not being, deliberately contrarian, but I have absolutely zero interest in this.
Okay. Even
and I don't want to kill your story and
no, you
the
haven't.
interview, but genuinely, I just and I've spoken to others who forgot it was even taking place. Looking forward to Katie Taylor. There's a men's welterweight world title fight on the bill. It's actually a decent bill, and on the upside, it's to a Netflix audience. I read somewhere they've got 300 million subscribers globally. Coincidentally, is the number that was said to have watched Ali and Frazier, the fight of the century at Madison Square Garden back in 1971. So, look, potentially, Katie Taylor, for example, I'd suggest there'll be a lot of people watching who've never seen a women's boxing contest, certainly at that level. So, there's a huge opportunity for a lot of people on the bill here to make a statement.
Yeah, well, I think the strongest argument you can make for Tyson Paul is that the night itself could be a gateway drug for a whole new audience, and that could be very, very good for boxing in the main. Like, it's interesting the way this fight's been talked about. I suspect this will make your skin crawl, but Mark Burkowski is quoted in the Guardian piece today. He's talking to Sean Ingle, and he was saying the root of this fight is absolutely that of WWE. It's a fusion of sport and entertainment. You feel part of it is staged. Will anybody get seriously hurt? I doubt it, given they were in 14-ounce gloves. So it's more WWE than WBA. And I saw Adam Kelly of IMG say, this fight is much bigger than boxing. This is the road and the roadmap that's going to prove the model for Netflix when it comes to sport. And like, even the marketing types are talking about how this is such a sweet spot because the boomers and the Gen Xers who grew up watching Tyson are obviously... well, not everyone, few exceptions, Mike, but there is a morbid kind of curiosity in 58-year-old Tyson. And then in Jake Paul, you have the younger generations.
I completely get the attraction of this, and I completely get where Netflix and Adam Kelly at IMG are going. I completely understand that. I mean, I look at where I work at DAZN, the Misfits series is incredibly popular. And I know
boxing has a rich. Sorry, boxing has a rich history of this kind of stuff. I mean, this is not new.
So it's not the first time, and look, it won't be the last time. And this is just part of that continuing evolution. And I think we might actually see more of this kind of fight in the future.
I suspect.
But there is a huge opportunity for others on the bill.
Have you seen Jake Paul fight before?
Yeah, I have, yeah.
What's he like?
Yeah. Well, I remember saying very early on that I used to coach at the club I boxed at in South London, only as an amateur. And I remember watching Jake and his brother Logan in the early stages of his career as well, and saying that after 2 and 3 bouts, if I had a boy in my charge who was boxing with that level of ability, I'd actually be very pleased with that level of progress. But it's how quickly they've risen up through the grades. And if you want to get a measure of who Jake Paul is, then you look at the Tommy Fury fight, and Tommy Fury's a long away from even British title level over in the UK, and yet he was good enough to beat Jake Paul. So that's kind of where we are. But I've got respect for the way they went into the sport and the devotion and dedication they put in. I don't have any issue with that at all. And I've said that on a number of occasions. But I also understand their background and what they bring to an event like this. on Friday. But also, I would say to those who dismiss, just listening to you there talking about 14-ounce gloves, which gives the impression that these two will be wearing pillows on their fists. I tell you, I've been in many a gym where they wear 16-ounce gloves for sparring, and I've seen knockouts. It can happen. Don't worry about that. So don't be swayed by 14-ounce gloves taking all of the danger away. That's utter garbage. But at the same time, I don't have any idea what the rules and regulations are here.
Yeah.
Is it being choreographed? Will it, will one of them be splattered on the canvas? I genuinely don't know. And I'm, as I say, not being contrarian, not trying to be overly cruel, saying I don't have an interest in it, but I genuinely don't have an interest, because Katie Taylor boxes beforehand. I'll be there watching it, but it's the Taylor Serrano fight and the Mario Barrios fight that's the attraction for me.
Yeah, because I presume you watched it. There was, I mean, people might think Tyson hasn't fought in a long time, but there was the exhibition against Roy Jones Jr. in 2020.
And that's what puts me off.
Yeah,
that's hard. It's hard to watch.
I hadn't watched it until yesterday. Gee, well, like even just as a product, it was so boring. I mean, these were just two old men falling on top of each, holding on to each other. Like there was no fighting.
Yeah, and in the end, you can only, whether you're Netflix, Amazon Prime, whoever, you can only put on so many of these that send people to sleep before they are no longer an attraction. So, I have no idea what's going to happen on Friday night. As I say, I don't know exactly what the rules and regulations are. Is this just something that's choreographed, or will they go for each other? I genuinely don't know, and that's clearly not being released.
No, I've heard all sorts of. Well, it's probably too strong to call them conspiracy theories, but I've heard it said, everything from Tyson's best chance to win this is to knock him out in the first 20 seconds. Right all the way over to, well, it's in the contract. He's not allowed to knock him down in the first 2 rounds or he won't get as much money. So this thing is going to be dragged out to 4 or 5 rounds. So, I mean, pick your poison.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to, the part of the show where, this is, it's going to be a real test of production. But when you start the show and then you get into the analysis of the fight, I mean, where'd you go with that? It's just...
Yeah. One aspect of it, just to get your thoughts on, which might be of more interest, is Tyson's standing in the boxing fraternity. Like, you obviously lived through Tyson, the fighter at his peak and the type of person he was then, and people I'm sure will know, even younger listeners, he was sentenced to 6 years for rape back in 1992, served 3 years, and he's been released. I don't know if you'd say redeemed, but the way people are talking about it, even, Katie Taylor, just like effusive about sitting down and meeting Mike Tyson and listening to him talk about the history of boxing, almost a kind of like avuncular figure. And people are aware as well, he's had a troubled childhood. He lost his daughter in 2009, aged 4, in just the most horrific, tragic accident you could imagine. It seems, Mike, he's reached a place, certainly in boxing, where his career is so iconic that overshadows any of the human failings, and he kind of seems beloved now. Is that your reading of how he's held in the boxing fraternity at large?
I'm still staggered by the number of young boxers coming through who talk about Mike Tyson as being their great hero. And it's clearly this ability to separate the boxer from the man. And in many senses, I did that as a kid with Muhammad Ali. There was a lot not to like about Muhammad Ali. I mean, he never went to prison for rape, but there was plenty of behavior outside the ring that you wouldn't teach a child of yours. But at the same time, I, like many fans of Mike Tyson, was able to separate the boxer from the man. And I think that's what's happening with Mike Tyson. There is this reverential attitude towards him. And I had a fascinating hour with him around the time of the publication of his autobiography. It was in 2013, and we were rerouted from London to a hotel in Paris because he wasn't allowed into London because of new rules that had recently been put in place about convicts and how long they'd served and what their sentences were. And so he was turned away at the border, and then we were rerouted to Paris to meet him. And I had an hour with him, and I saw and heard in an interview for BBC television. A lot, I wouldn't say every facet of Mike Tyson, but a lot of him. I spoke to him about not being allowed into London, and the reason for that was that women's rights groups were protesting, as well as the legal situation. The last time he had been allowed to come in, he was met at Heathrow by a chorus of women's rights groups, and we got into that conversation. And that then relating to the rape conviction. And at one stage, he shuffled in his chair and told me not to put words into his mouth. Do you hear me? Don't put words in my mouth. He said it twice. And then within 20 minutes, he was talking about the incident that you've just mentioned there, about the death of his young daughter, and how he went rampaging through the emergency room, the ER room at the hospital, wondering where his daughter was, and shouting at doctors and admin assistants wanting to see his daughter. And then he looked around and saw such grief everywhere and said, and this was, again, it sums up the amazing character and different characters within a single man. He produced this line, which is borderline poetry. He said, I looked around at all these grieving parents, and he said, I realized I didn't have exclusivity to pain. And this was 20 minutes after telling me not to put words in his mouth and then shuffling in his seat in a really, really quite frightening way. And so that was just two instances in a whole hour, when he was talking about the childhood, when he'd come home with pigeon dung on his shirt, and everybody at school would be laughing at him, and went right through his career. It's an amazing story all the way through. And I remember writing, around the time I did that interview, I wrote a piece for the BBC Sport website, and I began by saying something along the lines of, he's as compulsive as he's repulsive. And that's the contradiction around Mike Tyson. And that's why, all of that I've just been telling you is why at the age of 58 that he's still going to command a colossal audience on Friday night. Whatever I might think, or others in boxing might be turning away from it, that there's going to be huge interest, and that's only going to build as we get towards Friday night.
No, it sure is. Listen, we've taken up more than enough of your time, Mike. It's been so good to have you on the podcast. And I was going to say, enjoy Friday night, enjoy most of Friday night. And we might talk to you again sometime soon. Mike Costello, thanks so much.
Great. Thanks. Great to be with you guys.